Let's talk about these pieces now, and we'll have a little lesson, so watch the lesson for free, but if you're interested, I do have an edition of both of these pieces, and there's a link for that in the description. So this is originally for Baroque guitar, and in Italy, the Baroque guitar, the tuning of the instrument, creates some complications for arranging it for the modern guitar. In particular, the low fourth and fifth strings are actually up an octave, meaning that when you play a bass string, you're actually playing an upper register note that mixes with the upper strings as well. So when we make an arrangement for modern guitar, we lower that voice down an octave, but when you do that, that can create some complications in terms of voicings of chords, or how long the musical line goes, and whether you include the sixth string, or whether you include extra notes. For me, my goal with the arrangement is to keep the texture light and simple, because I think that's part of the charm of the music. Once I start adding in a lot of extra notes or really lowering the octave of the bass voice a lot, I find it starts to create like a classical guitar composition that doesn't really match the charm of the original intention with the plucky kind of Baroque guitar. So I've tried to keep it really light and simple in upper register whenever possible, but when that bass line needs to be defined down the octave, I do it, of course. But when the opportunity exists to keep it generally high, I do. I'm using a capo mainly because I like the lighter, higher pitched sound when I play the music, but it's completely optional. I'm not trying to imitate any kind of tuning. I just like that kind of more sustained and equalized sound that comes with the capo. So I'll actually do the lesson without the capo, just in case some of the intermediate players out there don't wish to use it, or if you just prefer the lower sound. Whenever I take that off, I just quickly give a tune here. You know, when you tune with the capo, usually you should tune with the capo on to make sure that when the strings get depressed, that the tuning doesn't change too much. Okay, so in the aria, at the very first measure, the original has the fifth string, but of course on Baroque guitar that would actually be up an octave, so I've lowered it, but I've actually raised the A in this case because I found the A and the D ringing out didn't sound so good. It sounds a little bit better with the A raised up. So that's one of the only places in both pieces where I actually changed the direction of the interval. And you can can see in my arrangement there's a little breath mark here. That's because in the original tablature there's actually a rest, but I don't think the rests indicate silence. I think they're just an interpretive phrasing idea. So that's my interpretation. It's just a little breath to tell you like, oh, that's the end of a phrase, or that's a little idea, not necessarily silence. So I do a bar right here, that way I can keep sustaining the E. There's another place, like I could have lowered that G sharp, but then there's no bass note here. I would have had to add it, and then suddenly we start getting really thick and almost like Bach-like style cadences and whatnot. So I actually just left it in that upper register just to keep it light and simple. Now it's very possible or likely that the Baroque guitarists of this era would play most of their trills from the written note. So like on that first trill in measure 2, they probably might have played it from the F. I really interpret all of these ornaments as very flexible, though. They would have been aware of both styles of ornaments. So I do mix and match. When I'm coming down from that A, I do a G. So I pull off from the upper auxiliary. And then I do a written note trill. So I'll leave that to you to some extent. The first one I did was G, F, and then the second one was F, G. And at measure 4, I do the C as a suspension. And the strums most likely were done with I and then the down strum with these 3 fingers. But on the modern classical guitar, I find that sounds a little bit harsh, so I do often use my thumb for the down strum just to smooth it out a little bit. It doesn't sound as plucky and like the Baroque guitar with the choruses of strings. I find the thumb does help a little bit. This is fretted like the original tablature. It's my fault. I'm used to the capo now. Those little notes are editorial additions by me. On the Baroque guitar, because the bass strings are up an octave, the chords end up sounding a little bit inversionless. So it doesn't really matter what if the third is in the bass or whatnot. So, but on the modern classical, it sounds a little bit better when it's in root position. So I've added that low A there. Same thing on the next chord. Although the original has a C in the bass. On the modern guitar, it doesn't sound quite right when we lower that octave. So I ditched that low C, so I have it in parentheses in the score, but I play an F for a root position chord. Sounds much sweeter. Sometimes it's easy to mute out that E by accident, so just make sure your hand is in a good position. And I interpret that last trill as a mordant. All the trills I've added in the piece are from the original manuscript, but I find them quite flexible. You don't always have to do a trill, in my opinion. And any extra ornaments I've added, I've put in parentheses. So for the Capriccio, same basic idea. I've lowered some of the bass notes, but not all of them, because again, I don't want it to get thick and heavy. I want it to stay light and cheerful and kind of charming. All the slurs in the piece are from the original manuscript, unless you see a dotted slur, and those are ones that I've added. So like in this passage, I've added these slurs. This next passage is all fretted like the original manuscript. You could do it in lower positions, but he does it in upper, so I decided to do that as well. But it makes that final slur not possible between the E and the D. And in the original manuscript, this is how he frets it, and he has a slur under there. So it's partly interpretive, but... You could do it differently. You could go down to first position quite easily. I didn't because he didn't, and it just keeps it sweet in the upper position. That vibrato would have been pretty thick, I think, like almost like an ornament, like an alternation ornament in the time period. But on the modern classical, I do a vibrato, but underplay it a little bit. You can add a slur there if you want or not. This fingering is I think worth it because of the transition from this chord to this chord. I find it's much easier if you do it like this. Ornament. I don't like to just kind of go like this. I like to arpeggiate that second chord. Just kind of, you can do something with it to change it a bit. So it's not too bland. And then this lovely sweet ending. So I did add that low G, and I added there because he goes from this note to the fifth string, but I just found that keeping it up so high doesn't match with the final note that well. So I did add that low G. And again, I use a mordant at the end, so D, C sharp D. It's just a trill symbol in the original. Really charming little pieces. Nothing too difficult, so I would say that they're intermediate. That said, there are a couple of little awkward changes, but you can finesse them. If you know it really well, you can work the musicality into the chord changes, and it all works out fairly nicely. No crazy stretches or anything like that, but there are a couple of bar chords and little things that you have to navigate in these pieces. But I really like finding works like this. They're like beautiful Baroque examples, or examples of beautiful Baroque music in a light texture, perfectly suited to the guitar, and at a level that isn't too taxing, but it's still mature in many ways, and very worthy of anyone's performance, whether it be for home practice or on the concert stage.